And of course, very, very good to have you here, Bijoy Jain, as our guest on Design and Dialogue. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Pleasure to be on this conversation.
And you are calling in from your home in Mumbai.
I'm calling from Mumbai, yes, from monsoon Mumbai.
Okay. As Melissa mentioned, please put your questions as we talk into the chat box and we'll get back to them at the end. And also let us know where you are calling in from. And I see that Lucy has just said hello from Cape Cod. Hi, Lucy. Bijoy, perhaps we could start with a very brief conversation about the prevailing situation of 2020 and what it's meant for your practice. Before we started the live broadcast, you were saying something very interesting, I thought, about the way that you have come to consider your practice in the light of the turbulent events of the year. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
Sure. So for me, it's not been really a change in my practice, but making actually very small adjustments in terms of, the way things are moving forward. This is one of the many things that we're going to be confronted. So I'm calling it a sort of idea of an erosion that's taking place, a cultural erosion, a climatic erosion that's taking place. And so this is actually in play. Now, for me, what's been interesting is the discipline of my practice has been just in the production of doing one thing every day. And I'm going to then come back to the Buddhist, but the idea was that, has my practice changed? No, my practice remains exactly the way it has been before all of this has transpired. It's more just sort of adjusting in terms of agility, resilience, response time, speed. So I'm talking, for me, it's like, how do you cover distance in time, with a certain agility? And I think for me, the practice is about, that exercise. And this is something that, the way I look at it is that the whole idea of the practice is to in some way slow the speed, because what we're going through is going to take time to reverse. It's not just going to happen overnight or in one day or in a very short period of time. And this whole idea of what I see, or the way I see of like the idea of what next, if one asks the question, is how do you slow this erosion down? And it's only by slowing the erosion down that transformation can occur, hopefully on the other side. And I was mentioning to you, we have caves here from the 5th century done by Buddhist monks and Jain monks, and they were confronted with the same situation at that time. So, history has shown that conflict is always going to be present. I think it's there to in some way provoke us, of how we want to participate. And I think that's the sort of fundamental question that's being asked of us, I think, at a more, at a level of, when I'm saying globally, but I'm also looking at this as an idea of a consciousness, collective consciousness of how we share ideas. And we'll have diversity of ideas, and sometimes they will not meet. And so the idea is to find a space that is a meeting point. So this idea is like a wave, they come together, move apart, come together, move apart. And so for me, the practice has really been more about that. And also one that is my own inward discipline, because these are some things that also go on within us. It's not external of us, the same things that are outside are very much present within us as a space, so it's in some way making contact of an interior world and an exterior world. And both that are in some way reversible. They mirror each other in some way. And for me, that's really been, the really sort of most critical aspect of my practice, which has become much clearer for me now. Did I know that this is what I was going to do when I started out? I would not have started out, if I knew that this was it. So it's a sort of day-to-day process. And I don't want to call it slow or fast. It's just something that one does, and they can be quick days and they can be slow days, and it's not to measure that that's how it has to go every day.
Yeah. So there's a daily registration of creativity, but no rules in advance as to what that should look like.
I think the way I would say there are frameworks, but the frameworks are quite open. I don't want to call them loose, but they're open to go out. I think the best way I could communicate that, for me, the idea of time is something that I'm really connected to this idea of the moon. That's something that I recognized very much within myself, my contact in this idea of a lunar time, and I've spoken about it also, that somewhere lunar time is embedded in all of us because that's our sort of fundamental DNA. We've come from that. Can we lose that? No, it's inherent, it's present. Along with that, over a certain unfolding of time, Greenwich Mean Time came in, when we were controlling the seas and water. And so Greenwich Mean Time has a different ideology or a different basis of its existence. Now that's our cultural basis today over, now a long period of time. And that too is embedded in our DNA. To say for it to go away, it's not. And so for me, it's this, this idea of these sense of understanding of these two, the sort of the essence of what these two times mean to us. One's a lunar flow, which is, we're bodies of water at the end of the day. That's our physical structure, or our atomic structure. And we resonate or we respond to that, so it's partly a response of, I wouldn't call it a reaction, but I would call it more an invocation or a provocation, depending on, the flux of the moon. And simultaneously, you also have things that are about control and time and efficiency, not about efficacy or effectiveness. There's a difference in an efficiency and the idea of effectiveness. So for me, this practice is really about, negotiating these sort of nuances for me. And that's really sort of the most essential part of, what I do.
Well, Bijoy, this is such a beautiful way to begin the conversation. I think we should turn to the work now. And first, we have a great experience that we're about to have virtually, where Bijoy is going to bring us through his studio through the means of a video that he shot earlier. And I think you will see here very much borne out some of the principles that he was just speaking about to do with permeability of past and present, of interior and exterior, and the way that time flows through this space. So the plan here is for Bijoy to sort of narrate this video as we virtually walk through the studio. So Bijoy, please take it away.
So yeah, it's an old tobacco warehouse. Actually, it was an old residence way back in the late 1800s. Then eventually it got turned into a tobacco warehouse and a cotton warehouse. And I occupy my home. So I'm kind of walking from my house to my studio. They're like barely like 10, 15 seconds away. Let me see. Sorry, I don't know what's going on.
There we go.
So this is just a walkthrough of my studio. It changes pretty much, I would say, every week. There's something, and I was talking to Glenn that the idea to produce one thing, and I'm not calling it new, but something is produced or documented, be it photography, an object, an instrument. So these are all just mock-ups. This is the sort of main courtyard, and it's a working space. There's no specific place that one has. The entire studio is an open space. And everything that you see here is actually all produced in the studio. This is actually a project because the metro is being dug out in Mumbai right now. And so I was interested in this idea of displacement and gravity. And what's interesting is the city actually delivers this clay and stone for free. The only thing you pay is for the transport that comes to your studio. But what's important here is that there's no contamination of the material. And so what's dug is actually goes down. So it's a mirror image of how it used to be before, but coming back into compression. And what all of this, sort of these big blocks are only held together with the presence of water. If you had to take away the water, these structures would basically collapse. And the idea of the thickness is to actually contain the water. So I've been very much interested in this idea of, objects, architecture, making of things that in some way are connected to the idea of which mimics our bodies, this idea that we are physically made of air, water, and light. And if we make things that are an extension of that or come from that material basis, so for me, that's been my preoccupation. So this is actually just something of a different scale, of a different dimension or size. So like in the studio, from making a thread to making an object of this size, all of these. So the idea is not about size, but about this idea of maintaining a sense of proportion. That's what I was talking about: agility, distance, and time. How do you traverse over this, and maintain a sense of proportion, which I liken to the idea of scale. So everything, that I'm sort of working. So this is a structure. It's like a scaffolding structure. It's just basically silk or cotton rope and bamboo. It's a sort of divinity structure that we find in the landscape. I also work with, I want to call them somewhere between, and I don't want to call them craftsmen or artisans, but they're kind of thinkers. They when they sort of participate, they bring another dimension into the way that they participate with the work. And so again, here I use the word invoke. It's this idea about all of this work, or all of this is produced with this idea of not an instruction, but an invocation to call upon, so to actually set up a core idea from which then that becomes a basis of a sort of a research, a material research that unfolds. So from bamboo, paper, bronze, copper, wood, silk, these are structures in tar, which over a period of years have actually, have sort of, there's a sag that's taken place, this idea of gravity and temperature and heat, and there comes a point where they become stable. So these are just sort of, these were things that, I did not even know myself that, that this is how it would occur. It was just a sort of an intuitive thought of, we had some objects, this idea of a lava flow, this idea of a power of a sort of, a lava flow that we see, urbanization, this idea of, material and how that begins to sort of create a palimpsest of objects that get embedded in them and how they slowly then begin to reveal themselves through that time. So this idea of that, this, I want to say that nothing is lost. It's only obscured in time. It's just blankets and layers and layers, so like a palimpsest that takes place. So in some sense, for me, these are sort of, it's this idea of making as a cultural basis, as this idea of like farming, you cultivate, it's an idea of cultivation. So the idea of making things in the studio is also the idea of, cultivation. You harvest the material, you work with it. It's like watering a plant and see it grow. So for me, that's really the nature of the practice. Again, it's kind of interesting how these then fold up into projects. They're not necessarily precise works for a particular project. Sometimes they're thoughts that are initiated and then somehow they find themselves entering into projects. So it's kind of like a research. We make little bricks in the studio. It came up more because, I was making something in bricks. Here in this country, we have like, we're a population of 1,300,000,000 people. And this, I keep hearing about this idea of, craft. I don't want to call it craft, but this idea of something dying or something we're losing. And so for me, the idea of moving to the idea of brick was that it came from the earth, it's off the hand. But we have at least 100 million bricklayers still present, because if we say that half the landscape here in this country is built outside the profession of what I do, so I still have access to at least 400 million bricklayers. So I have that much depth of field in the erosion, so that was, so the idea of doing these little bricks were to actually in some way create the same, how do I say, contact, but not a visual contact, a perception, like from all your senses, from the idea of scent, touch, sound. It's all you're doing is we're changing the size of the brick. So again, these are just, the colors that you see above, those are colors that are specifically made for work. We've not used even half these colors, but they become part of a research. I work with someone who's got a doctorate in color. These are little objects that documented what is called a laundry city. It's very close to my home, where they wash the laundry of the city. And these are the sort of footprint of the blocks. So we made those in soap, like this idea that, that footprint was going to erode and be taken away. So they were leaving these secret messages of the plan on these soaps. So yeah, this is just stuff, and it accumulates, they break, we try and keep them in, and there's no particular order. I mean, these things are in constant flux. It's in constant motion.
It strikes me that it also means that you're living in an archive of your own creativity, Bijoy. And I wonder if you would want to comment on that.
I wouldn't say that it's an archive. I would say that they're gestures of thoughts that I inhabit, and they're not past or present. I mean, the idea that how do you maintain them present within an environment, and so something will, that layer might fade for some time, and then they sort of come back because it's made contact with something else that has sort of drawn it out. And it's like seeds sitting in the ground, for 1,000 years. And there's this one particular rain, like, they had that, I think, if I'm correct, somewhere in South America, there was this whole thing that sort of just emerged. And so for me, it's this idea that there are more thoughts that are allowed to sit latently. They can be there quiet. And then they can sort of re-emerge. And that's what I said, that nothing is lost, it's only obscured in time, with this idea that, it's, I think another way that I would say this idea of like a diver in a sea, and it's, pitch black, and then, with a torchlight, and you suddenly see the torchlight sort of picks up this slight sort of movement, or like a glisten there, and then he kind of tries and moves it, and then slowly that glistening is there for a longer period of time, and then it slowly sort of reveals itself, because it's that idea of forming a relationship in that unknown, by shining that torch, and that other, object in the sea sort of slowly revealing itself, and so for me, it's more that idea that, there are things that I look back and I come back, and I sometimes don't remember what they were made for, but they suddenly open up something completely new that I had not even thought about. And so the idea is to live with them. While I'm saying this too, I lived in LA, and I studied in the US, and I was very fascinated with the idea, the whole idea of the way the Eames practiced. They lived in their environment. And so this is something that I remember when I was school, that, this is something that, I would like to have a studio, or my practice to be that way. And while I'm talking to you, I'm just, I recognize, more and more that it's, in some sense, that idea of, living with these things. So the archiving is more just wanting them to be more present. And sometimes they go away, they go to other places, or they go into storage, or they disappear. But yeah, that's.
Yeah.
And what's, sorry.
One of our listeners, Judith Solomon, has commented it's also a little bit like a diary, perhaps, which is maybe another interesting analogy. But
yeah, like it's a sketchbook.
Or a sketchbook that you're living inside. But one thing that I really struck me that you just said was, Bijoy, was that in a way, all of these objects are still just happening, and you don't know how long it's going to take them to turn into something else, and you also don't know what that something else will be. But it's not that they're not archival because they're not past. They're still,
yeah, they're complete in their incompleteness.
Yes.
Is the best way that I can put that.
Well, thank you for that tour. I think that will also really help as you now move into the discussion of specific works, because it helps us understand where it all comes from.
So I'm showing these slides more to create an atmosphere. So this idea of farming, because I have people that I work with that come from a particular part of the country. They come from West Bengal, and for generations they've been in sericulture, and so I was, and it's interesting, like here there is like a whole construction workforce that you can hire from the street. You go, they stand on the corner like with their tools, and you can tell who they are or what they do. in terms of their trade, but these were people that I met. And of course, a relationship then unfolded over several years. But for me, what is fascinating is this idea of depth of field, this idea that they have that much, I would say, I want to call it, they're embedded or coded with that kind of data of farming to grow the mulberry, to then take that to grow the silkworms, then to make the cocoons, and then to pull the thread. So they can do all of this in one hand, while in the other hand, they're laying bricks. So that's the sort of measurement of weight, or thickness or thinness or density or lightness, if you want to call it. That's the operating field. So for me, it's just been interesting, this idea of, and it's not so much that I'm, hand or machine or, I'm not nostalgic about that. But for me, there's something about this idea of what it communicates. What do we transfer through the palms of our hand? It's this, we have, and I think you see it everywhere, and not in a sort of religious way, this idea of receiving and giving, that it's an energy that that is emanated out of a space. And that's what this idea of energy embodied in materials. At the same time, man as a material too, that we're embodied with energy. And the idea that there's a meeting of these two energies. There's one communicating back, like I was talking about the fish, or this idea of that thing that was deep in the dark in the sea and the torchlight. They in a sense reveal to each other, but it's a process of being there, being present for it to sort of unfold, and for that moment then make that connection. So yeah, this is just, and that's how we make this idea of just making things in the most fundamental way, with like you use like this idea of so for me, I used to earlier say that, yeah, okay, this came out of, what if we didn't have electricity? But I like the idea that objects made from the sound of your breath, from the sound of breathing. That's it. That's all that is there. They've got a sickle, which you can see on the left, a couple of tools that are there, their hands and feet, and that's it. They harvest the bamboo, the silk, so on and so forth. So this particular, it's actually bamboo that's just been stripped, and it's only tied. There are no joints, there are no glue, it's nothing. It's a silk thread. And the reason silk, and this, so for what's important, it actually, they could produce this object sitting where they are. Everything is harvested in their land. So in some sense, I don't have to actually leave my studio. I can produce all this material in my studio. And the idea that there's an economy of means, I'm looking at this idea of that when I'm stripped of everything, can I still find expression, when it's sort of constricted, this idea of trying to find a gap when there's maximum constriction. So this is really a scaffolding structure. It's only tied, and silk parachutes and bulletproof vests were actually originally made from silk. That's the sort of strength that they have. So it's a scaffolding structure really, which is then just finished in an urushi, which is a Japanese. Again, these are just holes, pins, bamboo pins, and they kind of lock in there. And the structure is quite malleable. It also has movement in it. It's not it's not rigid in a sense. So it allows that flexibility for it to go. Again, it's just basically indigo dye that's been varnished on bamboo. And this is a silk rope. So yeah, that you see that particular piece which I showed, yeah, this one. And so this is a gentleman that I've been working for now for 30 years, and he's taught me everything that I won't say everything that I know about stone, but he is sort of, because when he looks at stone, he doesn't look at it as stone. He looks at what's embedded in the opportunity of every rock. And for me, that's sort of interesting. And so he's now about 85, 86, he was doing it. So I call him my oil lamp. I showed this little piece that was a sort of flame and an oil lamp, this idea of light emanating from inside, as opposed to this idea of it actually coming from the outside. So, this idea of light being reflected both ways, the lunar light, is it being reflected from above, or is it us reflecting it back? Just that notion. And it's quite interesting. I make a sketch or make a gesture and I communicate to him via WhatsApp or, via of someone that I have as an interface. And we have this communication and then he draws, then we'll send it. So you can see him drawing that. And what I discovered also in the whole process of making is this idea of weight. How do you make an object that carries weight into a sense of being weightless, but not in the pursuit of being weightless. It came also from the fact that one could move it, because he has to move the rock as he works with it. Huh. Again, this is just paper. The paper is actually made from exactly the ingredients that you see on your left. It's basically water. It's got an okra juice, which is added to the mix. And it's a particular mulberry that is dried. So you can see the dried part. And it's a sort of Japanese washi paper. And one of the things that I'm doing as part of my research and something that I unfolded, just traveling to Japan, to Europe, being here, that at certain periods of time, you kind of see these sort of ecological transfers or these transfers that have taken place, and you don't know quite. So the same exact process of making paper you find in Bhutan, which is the sort of northern region in the Himalayas out here where, and they have them in numbers. And you find the same plants, and it's interesting to discover this, like stones. And when people build with stones in the mountains, be it China, be it Switzerland, Europe, Germany, India, elsewhere, you find that the methodology of the way that they would construct was the same. The expression is what sort of differed, that's what gave it that diversity. But the sort of core essential was sort of embedded. So that's the idea of the material communicating how it wants to be handled, and the same in the reverse. So again, it's an obsidian piece of stone. And this object actually I call it a house for a firefly, and the electricity actually came in later. So it was a picnic that was out in the park with my friends, and I had to bring something to the table. So the paper that I had that carried my sandwich, and then I found the rock in the forest and bamboo twigs, and I kind of put this together just in that immediacy, and the light was a firefly. And so that was the sort of motivation of how this actually emerged. It was not with the intent to electrify the lamp. So the detail also has to remain, I don't want to say true to the core, but in some way it's a palimpsest. The object is a palimpsest unto itself.
Bijoy, can I ask a quick question about the way that you work with the artisans? And it's to some extent inspired by that story you just told of taking the paper and the firefly and the stone and bringing it into an object, which implies that there's a kind of interest in your practice on what lies ready to hand. And as you said, in India, so much craft skill and tradition and knowledge does lie ready to hand. As you said, hundreds of thousands of brick makers and similar numbers of other kinds of artisans in textiles, stone, and otherwise. My co-host Stephen Burks raised a good question in the chat box, which is how much of this is a mutual process, and how much are you intending to bring new ideas and capabilities to the artisans that you're working with at the same time that you are referring to their embodied knowledge, or what you described as a kind of encodedness. You mentioned briefly that you saw that as a two-way process, light passing both directions like the moon and the earth. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, sort of what you're hoping the artisans will get out of the relationship with you.
I think in some way to summarize so for example, the person actually folding the paper for that lamp is a carpenter. He can work with wax, he can work with bronze, he can work with metal, which I will show you in the slides later. So it's all about the dexterity of the hand. There's a sort of scale, or there's something that's there, and it's that registration. And for me, it's us finding in this mutual communication a discovery that this is what is possible in this sort of field. And that's why what I did mention was this idea of dawning upon me that while they can pull string from a cocoon in one hand, in the other hand, they're laying bricks, just to give you a sense of balance and weight. And the way that it works is to find a space that is new to all of us.
Yeah.
It's only when you discover that you learn. Otherwise, then it's repetition.
Hmm.
You're just then refining something. But if you're looking for this idea of learning, or that idea of opening a gap, and so that's part of the reason why this is it's a continuing process. It's one that it's not final. It's okay that right now the resources for this, be it manpower, be it economics, be it politics, be it whatever that is there that obstructs it, is then put away for that time. Doesn't mean that it's gone. It's there latent. So when the opportunity might arise again, for whatever gates open up for it to flow again, then you sort of tap into that. I don't know if I answered your question, but so I think I did so they're not instructions. I don't give instructions.
Mm.
It's more a sort of framework, a story of somewhere where, culturally we're diverse. They speak a different language, the clothes, the food, everything about them, the way they've grown up, the climatic conditions, everything about their environment. But so for me, the connection is actually, what is the meeting space? Where is that meeting space? And I don't want to be nostalgic or this sort of romantic idea, but I like this idea of something that will endure us and that will enable us to navigate through this time, is affection. And that's what we have to transfer between things. I'm not just saying ourselves. Be it object, be it food, be it music, be it literature, whatever it means. The idea that there's a transference of that is taking place, and that's an ongoing process. As long as we have that, we'll have the resilience to endure what we're confronted with. I think that's, for me, what is sort of the most critical thing. And it's drawing that out actually from that conversation,
Mm.
And it's not something that is a given that's there every day. You have to kind of work for it.
Yeah, cultivated.
Work in progress. Yeah, it's something that you have to kind of work towards.
I think also looking at these images of the bricks and how you're deploying them, it also just strikes me that it's, it has a special resonance that you're finding innovation within a repertoire that is as ancient as it is and has had so much previous innovation. So it's not like you're disrupting the course of a craft with some technological alien factor. It's that you seem to be trying to find innovation from within the language of the crafts that you're working with.
I would actually like the idea that there's that kind of intervention that occurs. I think, and I'm saying that more because here there's a certain economy, there's an affordance to this. Mm. If I bring that, then I have to start serving that other economy. And that for me is a losing battle.
Yes. Yes.
But if it did come in as an external force, I'm open to allowing it to enter. So that's what I said about, the clay pieces or the rocks that I put together. It's sort of tied into a flow or a field of economy. Now, if I had to conceive that project as an independent idea and say, okay, this is how I'm going to get the material, it would be impossible. I mean, it would just be ridiculous for me to even begin to understand the economics behind it. So here there was a certain flow that enabled me to enter into that space.
Mm. Yeah.
The metro is being dug, material is there, they're giving it away, or using it as landfill. And this was the closest dig that's happening to me. So it's the shortest distance, and so the truck comes here and we just have to pay for the trucking charge, which is not a lot. So what would have cost me several, like into 100 as an idea, I could do it for 10.
Yeah.
Just in that. And that's what I mean by that's the flow that comes in, how do you connect with that? So I'm not averse to this idea of a technological, I think it's important that we find a space that these can meet. One, we don't have to let go one for the other, and allow new things to emerge. I think that's, I don't want to call it progress. I think that's where there is discovery. Something emerges. And for me, the idea of progress is okay, that, I think somewhere notionally in the language of the way that we use the word, this idea of progress is, we've evolved into sort of finer beings or something like that. When for me, it's more, this idea of progress in terms of learning, in terms of discovery, in terms of, what are we learning, in some way to disarm prejudice. I think that's really fundamental. It's, how do you disarm prejudice, in terms of what we like and what we dislike. And for me, the practice that I'm doing is, for me, that's been the most important discovery. And that's why my practice is, how do I let go of my own prejudice? Because the moment I discover something, it can very easily become a prejudice as for it to be carried forward.
Yeah. Well, perhaps that is the place to have a conversation about progress, is in that overcoming of prejudice. That's perhaps the version of progress that's meaningful here. But perhaps show us the rest of these projects as well, so we can get to questions from the audience as well. And we have a few things left to see.
So this was a project done in 2010, and it's a sliver of Mumbai city. It's a space between a building and a boundary wall, and it's barely like 1.5 meters, or I would say 5, 6 feet, it varies. This is at the V&A in London. This was 2010. It's in the plaster court. So it's actually a sliver of Mumbai, because here you have like the gates of Santiago Compostela, which are at full scale. And likewise, that's the copy of David, which is one of the, I think, there are 2 copies like that in plaster. And so this is a 1:1 copy of that space. And it was interesting that, I didn't know that, and we only found out through a phone call that was received. While this was coming up, that particular structure was being destroyed, because it sort of lies in this liminal zone, this sort of in-between space of, while it's camouflaged, it's there and it's present. Everybody knows it's there. And of course, the owners of that were changing the property, and they sold it on. So this is the sort of archive of that now.
I should say, I was, sorry to interrupt, but I should just say I was at the V&A when this was installed in the cast courts. And one thing that struck me very powerfully about it was the way that the existing narrative around the plaster casts, which of course have to do with a positive being turned into a negative, mold being turned into a positive copy, so-called, the way that you were working with positive and negative space, and this idea of incarnating or manifesting the in-betweenness as a positive. So it seemed like there was a very rich discussion with the fabric all around it in the exhibition space.
Yeah, I think that was this idea that it's a space in between. It's a space of flow, in every way. And these sort of marks are basically, we hack into the concrete to plaster to sort of make them watertight. And so it's a sort of bas relief, from the outside, because there are a lot of bas reliefs that you also see in the plaster board.
So also using a piece of craft vocabulary as a kind of ornament in a sense, a sort of natural.
Exactly, yes. But that's what you see as a sort of, you see it in the landscape in the city. So it's something that's very present. It's a city that's in flux, in change. We were 5 million people in 1970. Now we're 24 million. That's we're 24 million, and it's dense in that way. And so you can, what I've also done is kind of shown you a perspective of just different sizes of projects, from a house to a piece, which is somewhere between a house and an object, and, small objects. And so the idea is, it's not about, that this was my old studio, which I've now, I've moved to another space, but it was a big yard, and we kind of worked outside. And so that's the model. And we were actually measuring the model to build the house. So what was interesting is that even the drawings that I would do then were not dimensioned. We would have these objects, we would have these, different, so I call them tools or means of communication. It's like a working drawing, but I'm making a working drawing that is atmospheric, between a model, between a mock-up, between a hand drawing, between a computer, printout, between a drawing that's been done on tape. And it's when you collage, it's like a collage. When you put it all together, there's a sensory feel that you create. So when the people actually are working on it, they embody it. And so those decisions that have to be made at that moment are sort of more immediate. It's not closed as a set of drawings.
It's that same kind of one-to-one practice that we observed in the video, where you have and of course at different scales, where you might have a small brick experiment in a case, but then you have the absolutely enormous displacement of the stone
That's right.
from the project. And it's always this kind of one-to-oneness, this immediacy and directness of scale that feels like a very important aspect of continuity, really.
So here, the essential part of the project was, we have to find water because we don't get it. This is the countryside. There's no tap, like there's no pipeline. So you have to kind of locate what was done. I think in several places, even now as a practice, these artesian wells, and we have to kind of build this in a month, 1.5-month window right before the monsoon set in, which is, mid-March, because that's when the water table is at its most, minimum, at its lowest. So we used basically the earth that was displaced as a fill on what was agricultural land, and then we allowed the rains to basically use the water to compress it. So you're allowing gravity to just push it as opposed to then sit with these machines to tamp it. And so 4 months later, it's prepared, the ground is prepared in just this movement of cut and fill. It's a balance of sort of displacing a status quo of a millennia of, years of earth that has been compressed and sort of reestablishing a sort of new format that sits in this landscape. So I'm just sort of giving you a sense of what that clearing in the middle is, where the space is built. So it's a sort of it's like a boat. It sort of floats. It's got a pile foundation, these very fine, thin columns, and there's a sort of floating slab that sits on that what was the earlier fill. Because you also have an upward pressure every year. Full moon, high tide, which we had this a week ago, and there's like pounding rain, and the rain doesn't stop. It's relentless. So if it's high tide, the sea is basically pushing in. And water that wants to go to the sea is not allowed to go to sea. And that's how we get a flood. And it pretty much floods every year. So this is it's registered the floodplain and sort of creates a plateau over that floodplain. So you allow the rest of the land to be occupied with that water for 4 hours, because once the cycle of, low tide takes place, the water then goes away. So it was really that idea of time, in terms of. So that's why you see the sort of undulation that you see in the project.
I can now understand why you spoke earlier about being connected to the forces of the moon.
Yeah, not just, we all are. It's just tuning into it.
Yeah.
Or rather, it provokes us to tune into it. We all experience it at some point. So the outside is actually covered in copper, and of course, the idea that it sort of develops a camouflage. And most of the houses actually doesn't require air conditioning. This is something that idea that how can I use air, water, and light as an atmospheric space that flows through the building. So while you're inside the building, for you, primarily the sensation of what you experience outside is exactly the sensation of what you feel inside. The osmosis of atmospheric air passing through, and how do you then protect yourself from layers of the season? But primarily, the entire exercise for these projects is about this idea of, how do you hold, how do you contain air, water, light?
And are you also interested in working with copper? So this is known as the Copper House, the second.
This was, it wasn't. I want to call it an obsession. This kind of, something. And I had developed a project which is called Copper House 1. That's why it's called Copper House 2. Which was on the sea, and it never got built, and this was sort of a back-to-back. So I think that was a sort of carry forward that came from there. But there were many other explorations done to cover it in ceramic, and and actually when I was covering it with copper, I had a waterproofing layer, so I've actually peeled back one of the layers. So the next house I did was actually pull away the layer that is, and just use the waterproofing membrane that you would have on a New York terrace, or it's an industrial membrane.
I guess what I was curious about, though, Bijoy, was whether you're also interested in the patination and color change that will happen in the copper over time. Is that something that you've encouraged and see that as part of the life cycle of the building?
Yeah, that I think it's inherent in the material, but that was part of the preoccupation of, this idea of camouflage, at a certain point where what is landscape and the idea of building is landscape. And so what for me is interesting is that, every time I return, and, this time I returned very briefly just before we went into lockdown after a fair period of time. And there's always, it's active, it's alive. You know, the surface is alive. Do you know what I mean? It's responding to atmospheric air. Like we are all responding to atmospheric air. You know, we patternate, you know, we change, you know, our skin, the moisture, the humidity, and likewise, same thing with the building. So here the stone actually was a found object, and it's quite I'm very quickly going. And this idea is that the stone is actually keeping the pressure of the uplift of the water, you know, in the flood. I mean, metaphorically, of course, stone would sink in the water. And so it's a donut that's cut on a floating slab, because if the water had to press upon and go past that floodplain, it could come up, you know, it's sort of a release. So I call this courtyard a space where it relieves the anxiety of the site. And in that, so are my clients, you know, their own anxieties. Because one of the things that for me is interesting that I discovered, like you would find that we sweep the floor a lot. Like one is because of the dust. But I realized this sort of living in the countryside, because our landscape can be quite hostile. It's tropical, you know, there's all kinds of funny creatures that are on the floor, especially in sort of wooded areas and things like that. So the idea of, you know, being protected and open, especially at night, you know, like I can occupy the external landscape if I'm 20 people all together. But if I'm one, I would not maybe do that, or I'd position myself closer to the house as opposed to going deeper into the landscape. Can I come off the screen share? Is that
sure? Can I just ask you one last question about this image before you do, though? Or
sure,
that's
sure. No, I get
you remember it, but I'm just wondering whether the decision to position the stone there also had to do with the staging of raw material versus processed or crafted material. Because to me, the use of that very monumental found object also gives me a sense of emergence, that you have the materials in different states of having been addressed by the hand of the worker.
Okay, so it's quite an interesting, I mean, so when I was doing this, I had this really big, it's called a rain tree, and it was being cut, and we got a phone call, and I went and retrieved it, and it sort of stood in my old workshop yard, this sort of thing, which was, you know, planks that were cut from the rain tree with shims, and it was left to dry. And I kept thinking that maybe that's an object that I place in here. So anyway, that never happened because I didn't want to part with it. It was sort of became this sort of energy field in the sort of yard of the workshop. And so I would walk into the house, and, you know, I would always, my sort of forehead would sort of go into this. And so the owner of the house, the lady of the house said, you know, I have noticed that every time you come in, you kind of have this one look that you make. And so, you know, so it's something troubling you. I said, no, nothing. I said, every time I walk in, I keep imagining something that obstructs it or that occupies the space. So he said, oh, you know, my mom's, you know, building something in the southern part of India, and she's been excavating the land, and she's found these big granite rocks. She's found these rocks. Should I get her to send them? So I said, sure. And that was it. And then a month and a half later, I think it was 4 in the afternoon, I get this very panicked telephone call that this truck has arrived with these rocks. And this rock is, you know, 5 tons or whatever. So I quickly, I knew exactly, and I had no idea what this thing was. So I jumped into the car, got onto site, saw the thing, and I knew. So, you know, I knew that we only had a 1-day period because there was so much anxiety built up in her. You know, so anyway, so, you know, crane operator was called, 50 people. I've not shown the video. It's quite funny. And we literally opened the front door, you know, and then we kind of pushed the rock in rather than pick it up with the crane, because here in India, like everyone will say yes, but they say yes kind of like this. And they also say no like this.
Yes.
And the same thing that they said yes to yesterday, they could say no to the day after. Okay. So I said, I'm not taking that chance with the crane, with the rock on top of that. There's no way. I'll push it in. And then we got the crane to come up with the boom, and that's how far it could go. And we had it on a kind of like a swing, and we just kind of slowly swung it in place. And there's a moment that it felt right, and we just dropped it, and that was it. Wow. So that's really how it emerged. But it some way occupies the space. It sort of, you know, that's why I said it holds the anxiety of the site. That rock is actually the energy field. For me, the house will disappear in time. But what remains is this sort of plinth, this space that allows, you know, an opportunity for something to reconstruct on itself. And that energy field, you know, They can choose to break it. They can choose to take it away. And it was interesting that one day, because I knew the next day when she would, when she would come, whenever I think it was a week later, and she wanted it out, but it was too late. And everyone else in the house was completely thrilled with it. They all occupied it. So it was this, so that, it was just, so for me, interesting. But no, it was not like this. It was not planned, and yet it was planned in some way. I had to frown. That was, she says, why do you have the frown on your forehead?
What a beautiful story. Okay, well, let's move on from the images. And those who have questions for Bijoy, please put them in the chat box. If I might go ahead and ask a first question. And this perhaps is a slightly provocative one, and I'm also aware quite a big question, but it's about the legacy of modernism in India and how you think of yourself within that story, if you do. So, of course, given the colonial past of the country and the complex story that must be told about architecture in the 20th century in India, modernism has many particular narratives and meanings there. And it strikes me that your buildings, and I'm thinking here particularly of your architecture, but also this is true of your object scale work, engages with modernism, but at the same time seems to also pull away from it and perhaps to offer a kind of counter narrative. And I wonder if you could comment on that whole set of issues.
I think the best way to explain this is, at home, my mom was an Indian classical singer, musician.
Really?
And I wore blue jeans and listened to Deep Purple. America was something that was very far away. We used to have these comic books, Jughead, and I'm sort of in some way responding to your question that, I'm an emergence that comes from that field that was there. It was an industrial revolution that was taking place at some point in the world, and like I said, this was something that I had absolutely no idea that this is what I would stumble upon. But again, it's something that you allow your sort of a sense to, you kind of follow your nose, or you follow your ear, or you know what I mean? You kind of go through that. And I mean, this is, so I saw Chandigarh in 1972. I was a young kid, 7 years old, or 7 or 8 at that time, yeah. And I remember when it was just completed, and we were, every year we used to go on a car drive for like 2 months. My parents were doctors, he'd take some time off. And we drove, east for 2 months, west. And this way I kind of saw, from Buddhism, Jainism, modernism, the Mughals, like the whole culture that kind of unfolded, in the temples in South India, fields, I mean, all kinds of things. It was something that my parents were both sort of had a preoccupation, but it was I realized that for me was one of the most important, the most valuable parts of what sort of got embedded in me, of what I saw, what I, observed in that. And, you're young and you're just open in some sense. So things just, come in. I remember I had these beautiful time and life books on, Degas and César and Duchamp. And I used to, and my parents would keep buying me these books. And I'm like, I'm not going to read these books. I used to love picture books, but and they would, he would say that, if you don't read them or if you don't find them, they will find you. So let them be there.
Beautiful.
And so I remember, we arrived at the Secretariat building, and it was this huge big structure. It was really hot. It was midday. The trees hadn't grown. It was still new. The project was just completed. And I was so overwhelmed. I just refused to get out of the car, and I just started crying. And I had to be then taken away, and I remember writing in school when I was in St. Louis a paper on Chandigarh, and I wrote about that because that's my experience of Chandigarh. It's not a commentary on modernism, or it's not a commentary. And so in some way it was, for me, Corbusier was, sometimes you have an uncle that you're sort of, who's overwhelming in some way, like, we all have someone like that. But it's interesting for me, to understand, what occurred, what transferences took place. We culturally, I mean, it was interesting. You also had Louis Kahn at the same time.
Sure.
were in India at the same time. And they both took completely different strategies of how they sort of approached it. And, you know, if you look at Corbusier, I mean, he actually comes from the mountains. His proximity to the sky, while Khan is, you know, a prairie, like flat field prairie man, like more to the ground. And it's clear in their work. And so, for example, Chandigarh basically, you know, it sort of mimics the landscape of the observatories that he was inspired by. Corbusier here in India, they're called Jantar Mantar, which is this kind of like, they were astrological instruments, architectural astrological, not astronomical instruments that you see in Delhi, in Jaipur. And he kind of constructed this on the roof, and that's the only open space. And I sort of I keep visiting now, and like the spaces below, which were grids, are slowly begin to get, they're more constricted, but the roofs still remain open, so the connection to the sky, right? So there was transference taking place. So what I want to say is that, and I said that, and that's what I meant by this idea of lunar time and Greenwich Mean Time, colonization as an idea of Greenwich Mean Time and lunar time, and the idea of, for me, the interest in the confluence of how they can come together, because both are still very present. You know, one was emerging, you know, as an idea of a hope towards this idea of progress, of evolution, and rightfully so. You know, I mean, at that time, one of my, you know, John Ruskin was writing, you know, Unto This Last, you know, when the Industrial Revolution was taking place. I mean, everyone thought he was probably crazy, you know, that he's the only guy talking about something else. So if you read Unto This Last now, or William Morris, they're very much present, you know, that view of, you know, I mean, you read it today, and it's like what you're reading in what you're reading in what you're seeing today, you know. So
in fact, Mahatma Gandhi very influentially translated onto this.
He was on a train from Johannesburg to Cape Town, something like that, and he came upon, and he translated that book basically verbatim, and it's called Sarvodaya, which means in search of truth, or the truth, and it's only the last like the last page, he kind of summarizes it and contextualizes it to here. But fundamentally, the core context remains the same, and that's what made that switch, you know. So for me, it's interesting. It's not about, actually, maybe, I think the best way I can, and this I only discovered, I think in some way to summarize why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's why I started off with Blue Jeans and Deep Purple and Jim Morrison as music, and my mother was singing. And she'd be screaming like, what the hell is this kind of music? But I think the best way I could, so I discovered that my first contact with architecture was maybe 2 or 3 years old. And I only discovered this was when we lived in the sort of northern suburbs, which is now all swallowed as part of the city. My father was a doctor. He kind of was quite remote at that time. And he used to do his rounds in that region, the fishing village. Anyway, and so there was a construction working site across from where we lived, you know, next door. And so that's where all the action, they're quite nomadic. If they came from the south of India, there's large families that kind of move together. You still see that happening. You know, you can still see that happening. And there are kids, there are dogs, and I befriended, you know, a 2-year-old in that family. And I wanted to hang out there because that's where all the action was, you know, the scent of the food, you know, everyone screaming at each other, kids playing. I mean, that's all where I wanted to be. And I remember very clearly, you know, so it was basically a plinth of earth, which was maybe like 6 inches high. I mean, 6 or 9 inches high, you know, just like an embankment, like made like that. And then just a hut, you know, which was the house, which is no bigger than, let's say, the size of a double bed, you know, maybe a little bit bigger than that. But every week they would basically, you know, plane their floor with cow dung and mud and do this. And then they had a fire pit. And so anyway, about maybe at 4 or 5, one day I went down, you know, to go and meet them, and they'd left. They'd all disappeared, the whole camp, and no one told me this. So this was like my first love, like this. And I remembered his name 5 years ago, it's sort of, you know, because I started exploring this idea of, you know, an absence or loss that took place, you know, things that as you unfold and as time goes by, like, yeah, I've experienced this sensation somewhere, and it's sort of, and his name kind of appeared again. And that's also about the time I started working with this material in the studio, cow dung, mud, all of that. Why this contact, you know? But I was not, I mean, that was not the, I mean, so that's what I said, that it was sort of latent. It had already been, you know, it had already been registered.
Yeah, it's another
and
example. the seed having
But
been planted long
yeah,
ago.
so you can see what I'm saying about how, for me, it's important an emergence of a third and not one or the other.
Yeah.
There's the discovery of a third possibility.
Yeah.
You know, there was a Mughal emperor called Akbar, and Mughal emperor called Akbar in India. And, you know, he was sort of trying to split an atom by trying to bring Islam as an idea, as, you know, and Hinduism together, to write a third language, to create a third, and for him to even think like that, you know, like basically saying, I want to split an atom. For me, that's the kind of, the thought is of that magnitude.
Yeah. Yeah. Very powerful. You know, we're almost out of time, but I do want to just take a question from Ashwini Bhatt, who I have seen great interest here. Ashwini, you've made a beautiful comment in the chat box, but I wonder if you could just try to verbalize the observation.
Yeah, so my mentor, first of all, this is so beautiful. I'm super nostalgic and emotional right now. My mentor Chandralekha always talked about temples in Kerala coming with two blueprints. One, how to build the structure, and the other one, how it will end. The idea that anything which begins has an end, or a circular time. I keep going back to it. Your comment on how the structure will disappear, but the stone might remain, made me think of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashwini.
Yeah, I mean, Chandralekha is an inspiring woman, and, you know, it's a small world in some way. I think I think it's not so much an end, but it's a blueprint of how do you construct a continuity, right? It's the end of a moment in time, not the end or a finality of, you know, it's sort of being obscured, like being completely, you know, decimated. I think that's because what for me is that they were coded with that. One is a constructive, instructive blueprint. And the second is how do you code it or embed it with this idea of, what for me was interesting is the idea of continuity, but some things will rise and then they will have to fall. And so it allows for that. And that coding, that's I would call it sort of a structural coding in some way, you know, of ethos. How do you transfer that? You know, that for me, like, you know, Ajanta, Ellora, like how did they communicate over 400-500 years and an ethos and an idea, you know, and there were no sort of drawings specifically, but it was sort of, and for me, the best way when I think about it is that they were not preoccupied with the finality of it because they were living it. So for them, it was not important whether they saw it or not. You know, they were breathing it, they were living it. And I think that for me, what I realized more recently is that I think that's for me, the idea of my studio. It's that practice that I have to live it every day, whether I have a project or whether I don't. You know, how do you cultivate that? And I think that's what they were transferring, that idea of the second blueprint. For me, my understanding is that, you know, knowing Chandralekha as a dancer, she's transferring material through gestures of dance. You know, it's energy through what's transferred by the movement of the body. You know, yes, you can document it, but there's something else also being transmitted.
Well, I'm afraid that our time is up, although by design or happenstance, that was an absolutely perfect ending. And I want to perhaps echo something you just said, that while this is the ending to a moment in time, obviously our conversation will continue. And it's been a tremendous privilege to hear from you over the past hour and be plunged into the world of your creativity. I do want to let everyone know that this Friday, Stephen Burks, my co-host on Design and Dialogue, will be welcoming Byron and Dexter Pert to the program from Goody, the design firm, which will be a fantastic conversation. And then I'll be back in a week with Dan Barber, the head chef of Blue Hill Restaurant, who's arguably the most interesting person involved in foodways here certainly on the East Coast of America. And he'll be speaking with Greg Moore, a ceramist who's been collaborating with him on some fascinating projects that, by the way, Bijoy, I think you would absolutely love, having to do with drawing the clay out of the ground and getting it onto the table. So please come back on Friday and then again next Wednesday. And as always, if you'd like to watch this conversation again, you can see it on the Friedman Benda website and nearing 50 other conversations. So thanks again, Bijoy, so much for spending time with us. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.